mean, I really, really am not comfortable with this. I
I, I,
feel
I just want to let you know you're live. I want I'm very, I understand you guys. Again, if it's okay to continue the conversation for a minute, but I'm saying if it's, you have to check the content for sure. What Rebecca's saying is 100% accurate. You have to check the source. I'm not sure if legally they could say that they're quoting Steinsatz's. I mean, I'm sure they cannot. You can't say that the translation we're using is X, Y, and Z, and then manipulate the text. However, if you're just going to go without checking who you're using and who the text is and what the basis is, it could very well be that it's Jewish, not Jewish thinking, not religious thinking, or even non-Jewish thinking. So that again, like Rebecca said, there's issues there. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's start with our class here, and that is the laws of Shabbos. Okay, let's bring up the text. Hold on. Okay, we're finishing. We're going to be finishing the laws of cures for animals, and other issues in the laws of Shabbos. Okay, so again, the text over here is allchabad.org, so it's obviously, and the text we're using for the Talmud is directly from the Steinsaltz Even Yisrael website. So, and I wouldn't upload text from Safari unless I was certain who it was. Okay, here we go. Law number, we're in laws, chapter number 87, law 19. So we finished these laws. We were discussing the main part of this, the bulk part of this chapter is dealing with the laws of cure for animals on Shabbos. Now, next chapter is going to be the very difficult chapter of Muksa. What can be touched and not touched? What things could we touch or use on Shabbos? Okay, well, we'll tackle that when we get there. Law number 19. Mutter lahazmin ein Yehudi lebeis lechalim b'Shabbos. It's allowed to invite a non-Jew to join your Shabbos meal on Shabbos. What is the law saying? Meaning to say, afal pisha asr b'yamtiv, although on the holiday it's not allowed, one should not have non-Jews at your table on the holiday. Why? There's a reason. Because halachically, we know that on holidays you're allowed to cook. Oyechel nefesh is allowed, but you're not allowed to cook for a non-Jew on Yom Tov. If you were to invite a non-Jew in the holiday, the concern is obviously if you're going to have 3 people, so let's say you need 3 pieces of chicken. If you're going to have 4 people, you need 4 pieces of chicken. So the extra cooking is not allowed because halachically you're only allowed to cook for yourself or other Jewish people on Shabbos, but you're not allowed to cook for non-Jews on Shabbos. So therefore, the concern is, even though in theory you could have prepared all the food before Shabbos, before Yom Tov, before the holiday, but most people cook on the holiday. So therefore, it's not advised to have guests, or he uses the words actually usher, it's forbidden to have guests on the holiday because you may add to your cooking for that person. However, Shabbos, you're allowed to have guests. Why? Because you're not allowed to cook on Shabbos anyways. So all the cooking has to be done on Friday or before Shabbos, Thursday, whenever you cook. So because you're anyways not going to cook extra, so there's no reason to be concerned to have non-Jews at your table on Shabbos. But we're not concerned about this on Shabbos because you have to prepare the food before Shabbos. Yeah, Rebecca, you want to ask something?
Yeah. What if someone has like a non-Jewish home healthcare aide for their older parent or a non-Jewish baby nurse and she eats with them and or they eat the same food at least? Like, isn't it like really not nice? Like a Chil Hashem almost to like not cook for like to like not give them if you're making food, let's say on the first day of Yom Tov, like not to make enough for them.
Okay, so that's a different that would fall under your obligations to take care of service on Shabbos. That's service. Here we're talking about guests.
Oh,
Service is not guests. So
okay.
that's an obligation of service.
Okay.
So just like you would have an obligation to take care of service on Shabbos, on Yom Tov, so you would have to then you would take care of service. But here we're talking about having guests. Guests is it's not a service. I mean it's a mitzvah to have guests with Achronas Zarchim, but it's not a service, so to say.
Okay, thank you.
So he says, and then he says the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch adds, Michael, I saw your note. It's the confusion on the links is because it depends. Sometimes it will run their link, and if they don't have time to prepare, they'll run my link. Okay. As far as Shabbos goes, but Shabbos we're not concerned about having people on Shabbos because you already did the cooking. And therefore, even if you want to have a Gentile in your house, not part of your meal, means just serve the person alone food is also allowed, because again, you're not preparing the food is already prepared. Even though one would say, but it's not your responsibility to feed that person. We know the halacha is that we also provide even for idol worshippers, because that's the peaceful thing to do, is to be hospitable. So therefore, it's not a problem to even serve a Gentile alone food on Shabbos. If Rebecca, we see Ein Mizonesav Alecha is talking about that this person's food is not your responsibility, is talking about a person who's not of service, but a person of service is your responsibility, unless there's an arrangement that she doesn't, that they have to bring their own food. And that could be nothing to do with Shabbos. But if that's, let's say, the policy of the agency, say that the service brings their own food, that'd be a different question. And therefore, the Rebbe says, the Kitzur says that for like you said, for Darki Shalom, then it's considered that it is your responsibility, and therefore you would feed them on Shabbat. You would feed a Gentile. You could feed a Gentile on Shabbos, even if that Gentile is not eating with you. Means if it's in a meal setting, that's for sure. But even if it's a non-meal setting, it's not a problem. On Yom Tov, it is a problem. On holiday, it's a problem because the concern is you may cook extra for that person. All right, let's see the footnotes, if there is any. We're looking for 41. When I prepared this class, I couldn't follow. Here we go, 41. Let's see, what are we talking about here? Although it's not your responsibility to feed, nevertheless, since we are told to feed the non-Jew, regardless of his financial situation here, the Mizrahi, and I think again, Machzeh Shekel, Shach, and in Yordeya says that it's not, we're not even talking about a case of charity. Meaning, let's say, it means what does it mean regardless of his financial situation? It means if a poor person comes to your door and needs to eat, so surely that falls under charity even for the nations. But we're talking about even if a person is not in a financial situation, the person could afford his own food or her own food, but just the person comes to your house and you want to be hospitable and they're not sitting at your table, that's also allowed on Shabbos. Okay. He continues, law number 20. Now we're back to the responsibilities for animals, care for animals. Now there's like I think Barbara, you're talking about like if your dogs sometimes need to be put in a cage or not a cage, behind some sort of fencing, even in your home sometimes. So we talked about that. That's allowed if the door is already closed. It means there's no escape outside of the house, so you're not trapping the animal because they couldn't get out anyways. You're just keeping them more confined to a space within the house. That's different than if you were to close trap them. You're not allowed to trap animals on Shabbos. But here, what about there's different kind of animals? You have some animals that when we were growing up today it's not allowed, but when we were growing up as children in Seattle, so when we would walk to the synagogue, we had a long distance to walk. We would walk about 40 minutes. And unlike today, where it's unheard of that, I mean, at least as far as I know, where those days in the 80s, pet owners would wake up, open the door, let the dog run, and so they could continue to sleep, and the dog would eventually find its way back home. And as kids, we were scared of dogs because we didn't have a dog at home. And when we walked to the synagogue on Saturday, there were quiet streets, people were sleeping, and we were the target of all the dogs running on the streets. But today people don't do that. You're not allowed to let your pet run wild in the streets. But there's a concept where certain animals, domestic animals, especially like for instance, and even today in the Golan Heights in Eretz Yisrael, the cows that belong to private farms, they graze all over the place and they come back at night. So like this, behema chai v'oif, you have the animals, beasts or fowl, shlehurglu adayin lavei be'erev likluv shalem. They're not yet trained to know to come back to their cages. So you have to find them. It means they haven't been trained yet to know where their home is, and they could just go out and graze and come back at night. But even if in a situation where they are trained, but they're not obedient, right? They're out of control. They're kind of they're kind of rebelling and escaping. Basically, there requires some sort of trapment, right? You're not allowed to bring them into the cage or to their pen or into the house, because then you're trapping them because they want to run wild, and you're trapping them. You're not allowed to trap on Shabbos. It's one of the prohibitions on Shabbos. Even if they're already in your house, but they're not trained or they're wild, means you're trying to train them, but they're not listening, and you're scared they're going to run out of the house, and your door is open. You're not allowed to. It's forbidden to close the door. Because by closing the door, you're trapping them, and it becomes the prohibition of trapping, which is a violation of Shabbos. So basically, what do you do in a scenario like that? If you have such an animal, you have to have a plan, a strategy before Shabbos, not to ever allow them to be in a scenario where you're forced to close the door on them. Now we're going to go to the footnotes about what about if it's a danger, what about letting the animals out and, is going to cause them to get harm, let's say the coyotes are running around. So let's see, nothing against coyotes, but just in case. Let's see footnote number 42. Okay, so this is the law of the Kitzur. So he says like this: the malacha the oiraisa of tzeda. What is the biblical prohibition of trapment? Is capturing or trapping applies to those animals and birds that people usually capture on trap. That's the violation. Like you wanted to trap a rabbit, a wild rabbit, or a deer, right? Hold on a second. Something's jumping on my page here. Okay, here we go. So the capture or trap. The deraisa prohibition applies only where the capture puts the applies only where the capture puts the creature into a situation where you can now get hold of it with a single swoop, meaning it's totally trapped. To close, we're talking about the biblical. For instance, if you have a huge yard that you close the door of the yard, that the horse, a wild horse, comes in, you can't get out, but you still can't capture because it's running around the yard. So that's not the same thing. That's not the biblical. Okay, we're talking about the biblical. So he says again, the malacha deraisa of tzeda, capturing trapping animals, applies to those animals, birds that people usually capture in a trap. The deraisa prohibition applies only where the capture puts the creature into a situation where you can now get hold of it with a single swoop. It's in a confined space. For example, within the confines of a small room. However, if the room is large or the space is large and you cannot easily get hold of the animal, then closing the door of such a room when there is an animal inside would only be a derabanan prohibition, a rabbinic prohibition. Not that you're allowed to do it, but just to know if this is a deraisa, a biblical or derabanan. Biblically, it's trapping it in a way that you have access to it immediately. Like, when they put the bull into that little or the horse into that little space. But if you have a wild animal running into your yard and you close the gate, good luck trying to get hold of it. So that's not biblically called trapping, but rabbinically it is called trapping. Now, so that's the law 20 and 21 go into each other. So law 20 is basically that if they are not trained or trained but not listening to their training, so you're not allowed to even close the door into your house to lock them in on Shabbos. Okay. However, law 21, v'im kfar hugelu, but if you already trained them, v'hema b'nei tarvus, and they are domesticated, shedarkan lavi be'erev l'mkaimim v'yatsu, they usually come home at night, and they went out now, right? So you let them go, they come back, right? Like those dogs in the 80s that would know where the home is, and they'd go back into their space. You can voice them, but then right now, you have some reason to be concerned that someone may steal them. So now you want to do something. It means in theory you would let them come back at the right time. But for whatever reason, there's a moment now that you're concerned that someone may steal them, maybe a rumor went out. So then you could kind of push them along to go where they should go. You can't pick them up because even if it's in a private domain, because they're muktzah, you're not allowed to touch an animal. We went into discussing that. And we discussed that there are those who say that really a domesticated dog you could hug because it's different. But we're talking about regular farm animals, let's say, according to the opinion that you could hug a dog that we spoke about last week. So in these cases, 2 weeks ago, sorry, in these cases that the animal is domesticated and you have a concern now and you're trying to get them, it means not they're not being wild but not coming home now, because you're trying to get them to come home out of schedule. Usually they'd come home when it got dark, but whatever reason you want them to come in now. So then it's okay to kind of push them, nudge them along, as long as you don't pick them up, because they're technically trained. You just kind of trying to get them to go out of their schedule. Okay, so footnote number 43 and 44. It says like this. Why? Since they are domesticated, even capturing them outright is only d'Rabbanan. Means that what he's saying over here is very important. The biblical prohibition of entrapping animals is only to wild animals. The very fact that they've already been domesticated means that even entrapping them would only be a violation, a prohibition rabbinically. Driving them is permitted in such a situation, so says the Shulchan Aruch 316 and the Mishnah Berurah 31637 and the Kehilchatah. Okay, so that's why in this case you're not going to trap them, but you're kind of going to push them along. That is allowed. So it's not only. So then it's not. You're not doing even a rabbinic prohibition by pushing them along to come home early. If for whatever reason you got a scare and don't want them to be out, or whatever reason doesn't. He gives an example. I think is only an example. Let's say there's bad weather conditions, it would be the same idea, right? If it's raining or it's about to rain or it's hailing or something, I mean something that you're not comfortable with them being out anymore, it would be allowed. He says this: if only capturing them by hand will keep them from escaping, what happens if, let's say, it's a rabbit or something, right? I don't know. Maybe I don't know if you could domesticate a rabbit to the extent that it would come back home. But let's say you can, or a cat or something. So you can't nudge them along. They're just not going to come. So if only capturing them by hand will keep them from escaping, we're talking about domestic animals that know on their own to come home, and you're trying to get them to come home or into their space, their safe space, outside of their normal schedule. So the Mishnah Berurah in 30570 says, seems to lean towards the ruling of the Magen Avram, who prohibits handling muksa even where the loss of the animal may result. Means the person says, 1 second, I need to pick up the animal because it won't go into its space. So the Mishnah Berurah says, based on the ruling of the Magen Avram, that you're still not allowed to pick up the animal. Eliyahu Rabbah and the Chazon Ish disagree and allow capturing them by hand to prevent the animal's escape. See also the Mishnah Berurah 308 to 151. I'm not sure, but maybe the Mishnah Berurah over there brings down a second opinion. The Chazon Ish was I think a little after the Mishnah Berurah. The Chazon Ish passed away about 1930s or so, and the Mishnah Berurah, the Chafetz Chaim passed away before. But either way, there's the Mishnah Berurah is the Shulchan Aruch of the Mishnah Berurah. The Chazon Ish was a posek who passed away here in Eretz Yisrael. All, of course, there's different opinions. So the opinion of the Chazon Ish is that in a case of concern and the animal won't come in, you could pick it up, where the Mishnah Berurah is more strict and says you should not pick it up. Okay. How about assisting animal birth on Shabbos? If you're a farmer, what have you. So he says like this, in law number 22, Ein miyaldin es habehema b'Shabbos. One is not allowed to deliver an animal of its offspring on Shabbos, va'afilu l'sa'ada, even to assist it, hainu she'oiches es avad shlo yipol aretz, meaning to say, to catch the animal that shouldn't fall down on the ground, also is prohibited. So says the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. Let's see footnote number 45. Okay, you have to remember something that Michael, no, rabbinical prohibitions are not optional. The difference is just in the severity of the transgression, and there are, unless the Shulchan Aruch, based on certain principles of how in what cases the Shulchan Aruch, the code of the Jewish law, would allow a rabbinic scenario. There's different structures of how we would approach under extreme circumstances if it was a rabbinic or a deraisa, if it was biblical or rabbinic. But just to say, well, I don't want to accept the rabbinic, that's actually not allowed at all. We accept all rabbinic rulings are final, but in the structure of law, the law may find reason to be lenient if it's rabbinic versus biblical. But on our own, we don't have the right to say, well, I don't accept rabbinic rulings, it doesn't work for me. Okay, because excellent. I'm glad you understand that. Okay, perfect. All right, footnote number 45. Okay, so the Kitzur says you're not allowed to assist at all in the delivery, right? So the Magen Avram 332 says like this: where there is danger to the life of either animal, meaning the mother or the child, you may ask a non-Jew to aid in the delivery, because you're not allowed. Amira lenachri in general on Shabbos is prohibited. You're not allowed to ask a non-Jew to do an act on Shabbos for you, to turn on the light, to make a fire, cook food. You're not allowed to. But in this situation where the delivery of the child could harm the animal, the delivery of the animal could be harmful for either the mother or the animal, so then you're allowed to ask a non-Jew to aid in the delivery. If there is no one available, you may help in the delivery. So says the Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish says that even if for whatever reason, okay, obviously it's not always there's someone around to help you, so then you could do it on your own. Obviously, if there's someone around, better ask someone else, a Gentile, to help. But the Chazon Ish says even if there's no one around and there's a concern of harm to the animal, then you could yourself assist the animal. So says the Chazon Ish and the Pri Megadim. Okay. So his structuring this footnote is a little interesting. I mean, and again, the Chazon Ish and not sort of the Chazon Ish is the Pri Megadim is a commentary on the Magen Avram, assumingly in this case 332. So I'm not sure if you have to look at the original text to see if the Magen Avram himself agrees with it, or if they're just more lenient than the Magen Avram. But either way, in the footnote, the conclusion is that in a situation you have who to base on, the Chazon Ish or the Pri Megadim, that in a case where there's no Gentile around to help with the birth, you may yourself do so as well. Okay. Footnote number law number 23. A wound, a freshly maka b'tchilasa, a fresh wound that was afflicted on the animal. Sheyesh lebehemat sar mimenu, and the animal has pain. So sachin oisa b'shemen, you're allowed to apply oil as a way of an ointment to relieve the pain on the animal on Shabbos, if it's a fresh wound. Ava b'soif, if it's a wound that's already been there. She'ena sichel im shum tani gasir, where the ointment is only going to kind of is only for extra comfort, but the basic healing already started already, so that's forbidden. You're not allowed to do the extra comfort on Shabbos, but the initial healing to help the animal in its wound, you're allowed to. Okay, let's see footnote number 46. Because he says it's considered unnecessary and bothersome activity for the person, and you're not allowed to do a bothersome activity on Shabbos, so you are not allowed to put the ointment on the animal if it's an old wound. Okay. How about animals eat sometimes things they shouldn't be eating and get into some pain? And how could you help the animal in such a scenario? If the animal eats too much vetch or other kind of foods or grains or grasses that may cause it indigestion and pain, you could take the animal to run around in the yard, to tire it out and kind of heal it through the kind of running out jogging out the pain. If it has an issue where it gets sort of a fever, you could put it into the water, cold water, so it should cool down. And if you don't let the blood, sometimes they would let the blood to kind of and as a process of healing. So if you are concerned the animal will die if you don't do that, so you're cutting a wound on Shabbos, you can ask a Gentile to do it So any kind of healing, isolate in Yehuda, you could take it you could have a vet come by, obviously in a way that's permissible on Shabbos, to treat the animal. Okay. Number 47. I'm just saying a vet out of convenience. Obviously, you don't need to have a professional. If there's no one around, then a non-professional could do it as well. All right, 47. The prohibition against administering remedies does not apply to animals. So ideas of medicines, not that we're going to have to learn about later. But there's not using certain medicines on Shabbos is not allowed, vitamins, etc. So you have to. We'll get to that in its right time, but that doesn't apply to animals anyways. So the different kind of remedies that we would do to try to help the animals is allowed on Shabbos. 48 is about the asking a non-Jew to bleed. Shulchan Aruch 332. But Mishnah Brura and Chai Adam rule that even in order to prevent the animal from experiencing pain or illness, you may ask a non-Jew to do the bleeding. So again, the Mishnah Brura is lenient in this case and says it doesn't have to be in such a severe case where the animal may die. You know the animal won't die, but it's in extreme pain. Even in such a case, the Mishnah Brura and Chai Adam says you could ask a non-Jew to do it on Shabbos. Now, of course, you have to remember something. We're not talking now about the laws of Amir al-Nakhri, of what you can and cannot tell a non-Jew to do. In the laws of telling a Jew and non-Jew, there's a lot of leniencies. For instance, if a non-Jew would walk into your house and see your animal in pain, even according to the opinions that would say that you're not allowed to tell the non-Jew to do it, for the non-Jew does it on his own, doesn't mean you have to stop the non-Jew from helping. And there's many scenarios of how that law, there's room in Amir al-Nakhri in asking means to straight out go to a Gentile and say, turn on the light for me on Shabbos, or turn up the flame for me on Shabbos, or turn on the air conditioning for me on Shabbos. Is complicated. You're not allowed to, unless there's scenarios that allows for it. But there are ways for asking the non-Jew to do something that you benefit from, as long as the non-Jew benefits, etc., etc. So there's scenarios, and those are the complicated laws. They're not simple laws of Amir al-Nakhri. What could you say to a Gentile to do on Shabbos for you? Here we're talking about the strict letter of the law, to go to a Gentile and say, please help my animal. But if a Gentile were to walk in, or you some way or another get the animal to the Gentile and he sees this or she sees the situation and helps it, obviously we're not saying you have to prevent the Gentile from helping the animal. And again, the Mishnah Brura says you're allowed to even tell the Gentile if the animal's feeling pain. But the question that we're having is a strict letter of the law of how do we deal with Amir al-Nach with animals. So you're allowed to, according to the Mishnah Brura, even initiate a conversation with the Gentile to ask if it's relieving its pain. And even according to the opinions that would say no, it has nothing to do, there's the same leeway that you would have with Amir al-Nakhri and any other prohibitions on Shabbos would most probably apply to this scenario as well. Okay. We are, I think we finished 48, right? Yes. Okay, now we're going to get to the very complicated laws of Muksa. And what do I say the complicated laws? Because it's not so simple. If then my computer works with me. The risk of technology. Okay, here we go. We're holding chapter 88. The laws of Muksa on Shabbos. Okay, we'll see what Muksa means in a second. But these are very complicated laws of what you're allowed to handle, what things you're allowed to handle on Shabbos. What you're allowed to touch. If someone says don't touch that, it's Muksa. What does that mean? So we're going to tackle these laws in chapter 88. We'll go through them slowly, and please ask questions if you have any. Muksa midas. Okay, before we get, let's just see what Muksa is. Muksa, he says, is Aramaic. It's an Aramaic word, which means set aside. An object that may not be moved or handled on Shabbos or the festivals. And you could read up more about Muksa because it's been set aside, meaning you're ready mentally or by certain actions or by its criteria will not touch it on Shabbos. And there's many categories of Muksa. Means there's what's called Muksa Machmas Mios, Muksa Machmas Isur. There's what means the rule of Muksa means it's been set aside. What makes it set aside could have different criteria. There's a Mios means something that's disgusting. And normal people wouldn't touch it because of its Mios, because it's appalling. So that means on Shabbos you're not allowed to touch it because mentally a normal person has made a mental note in their head saying I won't touch this because it's mios. So because that makes it forbidden to touch on Shabbos. Then you have muktzah machmas iser, where the prohibition it's something, for instance, a candle. You're not allowed to light a candle on Shabbos. So the whole situation, the candle, the candelabra, becomes muktzah machmas iser. You're not allowed to touch it. Why? Because on Shabbos, Friday night, it had a fire. You're not allowed to touch a fire on Shabbos. Even once the fire extinguishes, some point in the night, the whole candelabra is still prohibited because its use is for something which is prohibited on Shabbos. That's called muktzah machmas iser. There's many things that would cause this thing to be set aside. So we're going to go through the rules of what is considered set aside, and what is the reason it's been set aside, and in what cases can you use it on Shabbos and cannot touch it on Shabbos. Okay, so let's see the original text. Muktzah midas. If you have things that the following items that are not that you've put them away intentionally. Dainu, meaning to say, shehiksahu ha'adam idaitai mil'achle b'Shabbos. Let's say you decided not to eat a certain food on Shabbos. Why didn't you decide not to eat this food on Shabbos? Because the only way you could eat it now is in extreme circumstances. It means typically you would not eat it now if you were extremely hungry. In its condition now, your family not allowed to cook on Shabbos. So in its condition now, you could eat it, but only in extreme circumstances. So in theory, you don't, in your mind, you set it aside. I'm not eating it because you would only eat it in extreme circumstances. So extreme circumstances is not something you plan for. Or it's not in an extreme situation, but you have a store out of your house. Right? You have cookies. You could eat them. There's nothing wrong. The cookies are ready, but you've baked them to sell. So you've set them aside because they were set aside for business reasons, and now you want to eat them because you're hungry. But before Shabbos means they were baked initially to sell, so you've set them aside l'schayra for business. So afal pi shenosni la'itzer, even if you put it in, let's say it's storage to be sold, or because you're not going to use it because it's not ready to be used. Or let's say it's not ready for you, can't eat it, but you could feed it to your dogs. It's animal feed. Even though you weren't thinking to feed it to your animals on Friday before Shabbos, you may be thinking to use it in another manner after Shabbos, but now your animals are hungry. So therefore, in theory, you could feed it to the animals if you decided to. What would be an example of food that wasn't ready on Friday? Let's say an animal died on Shabbos. And in theory, on Friday, you didn't know the animal was going to die. But now that it died, in theory, you would like to feed it to your dogs. So let's say that's what you do. Or other animals that eat raw meat, right? That died on Shabbos. Or something that changed from how it was yesterday, that now its circumstances have changed. But it still can be used for something. For instance, we're not talking about food here. Let's say you have a vessel, something that yesterday it was good for one use, and now it broke. So it can't be used for its original use, but you could use it for something else. It still has use, but not its original use because it's broken. So is this considered muktzah or not? Or the bones. You eat a steak on Shabbos. You prepared a rib roast in the bone, right? What about the bones after you finish eating the meat? And now you want to throw them to your dogs so the dog can have a bone. So although seemingly there's a level of muktzah here, there has been a set aside on some level, but it's not on enough of a level to make it a prohibited thing to touch on Shabbos. He says aside for things that you mamish reject like drying dates and raisins, which we're going to learn in the footnote, that the process of drying dates and raisins, during that process, it's mamish put aside. You have no intention to use it. It's even not, it's, in that transition that the dates go into being dry from fresh fruit to dry fruit is really something you don't touch. So then it's totally set aside. But otherwise, all the scenarios that we quoted until now of things that kind of were set aside, or their circumstances changed, and now you want to use it for another use, like the thing that breaks or the bone off the steak. So it's allowed to be touched on Shabbos. Means if you're eating a T-bone steak and you finished, you're allowed to pick up the bone, although you're not going to eat the bone anymore, and throw it to your dog, because even though you have set it aside for yourself, but it's still usable for your for the things that you care for, like your pets. Okay. Let's go through the footnotes on this. So we describe muktzah. Muktzah means things that are set aside. And so, for instance, things that you put away for sale. Shulchan Aruch 3:110. So even though you put it away for sale, let's say like I said, cookies, you made cookies to sell. So in theory, you put it away. You don't plan on using it, but for whatever reason that changed, the plan changed. So you're allowed to touch them on Shabbos. You're allowed to eat them on Shabbos or touch them on Shabbos. For instance, he says if an animal dies and you want to feed the animal on Shabbos to your dogs, let's say, having died without shechita, they are fit only for animal consumption. Meaning, what does it mean, nevela? Means if you slaughter it, it's different in theory, but you're not allowed to slaughter on Shabbos. But in theory, slaughtering is not the problem, because it means you're allowed to slaughter on Yom Tov. Yom Tov you're allowed to slaughter. If you, according to, we'll learn in the laws of Yom Tov, what are the conditions to slaughter on Yom Tov? But halachically, you could slaughter on Yom Tov and make the food on Yom Tov. But here we're talking in a case where you couldn't slaughter before Yom Tov. I'm not going to go into the details. But here we're talking about you didn't slaughter it to make it permissible for human consumption. Kosher consumption means Jewish people only eat meat that's been halachically slaughtered. But here the animal died of whatever caused it to die, natural causes or whatever. So then it's not fit for Jewish kosher consumption. However, you could give it to you could feed it to your domestic animal. So therefore, you're allowed to pick it up on Shabbos. Footnote number 3. Shulchan Aruch 324 number 7. Eliyahu Rabbah and the Gra Vilna Gaon suggest that where the animal was in good health before Shabbos and died unexpectedly, it is a muktzah. Here he says like this. Okay, this is the shaila. The shaila is basically how much thought has gone into the possibility of the animal dying on Shabbos. If there's absolutely no thought that this animal should die on Shabbos, it means you totally had no plan. There was no scenario. There's no reason that this animal should have died on Shabbos. For instance, it was in absolutely good health, and whatever happened unexpectedly. So the opinions of, I think he says the Eliyahu Rabbah, the Gaon of Vilna, suggest that in that case it would be muktzah. Means if the animal is there could be a scenario that the animal would die on Shabbos. So somewhere in your mind you thought that if it dies, I'll feed it to my dogs. But if there was no scenario that was in your mind, so you kind of set it aside. It was never a plan to feed this as animal feed. So then, according to the Gra, the Gaon of Vilna, and Eliyahu Rabbah, then there would be muktzah on Shabbos. You know the famous Gemara, when David HaMelech died. Okay, so footnote number 4. What we're talking about, a bird or something that took a new form from today, in other words, on Shabbos. It means it took its new form on Shabbos. Like he says, the vessels that broke. So he said, okay, here's the question is, it's fit for it's not fit for its original purpose, but it's fit for some sort of purpose. If what would be the purpose? He gives an example: to hold food or drink. Means it wasn't made for that, but now you could use it for that. It is therefore not considered noilad. The question is like this: a newly formed object. There's another prohibition on Shabbos. You're not allowed something that's come into form. Beitza shnel to b'yamtiv, right? Something that's come into that wasn't here before and comes it's recreated a new form on Shabbos. Then it's muktzah because it wasn't there before. So in this case, the vessel broke. It was made for one use. Now it has another use, but it's kind of similar to the original use. Because it's similar to the original use, Therefore, he says it's not considered noilad as if a newly formed object. However, if it is fit for an entirely different use, means the broken pieces are totally not fit for use of, let's say, food. It would be null, then it would be considered as if it's a new object that's created on Shabbos, and the new object wasn't in your options for Shabbos, therefore it's muksa. That's the opinion of the Magen Avram. Others, the Bach Taz, we learned a story about the Bach and Taz, father-in-law and son-in-law, Eliyahu Rabbah, Tosfos Shabbos, rule that it remains fit for any use whatsoever. Rules that if it remains fit for any use whatsoever, it is not muksa, and so says the Bir Halacha Mishnah Brura. So there's a disagreement. If it, I can't imagine a clear scenario, let's say, of the vessel. When he gives an example, he says, that if it's, let's say, a pitcher, but now it could still be used to be a receptacle of some sort of food or liquids, obviously not in the same way before, then, obviously in a safe manner, if it's, not in a way that would cut you. Let's say a cup that broke, an earthenware cup, so it's not sharp, so you can't drink out of it, but you could put salt in it, on the table. So it wasn't meant to be a salt receptacle, it was meant to be to drink out of, but now that it broke, you could put the salt in or the olive oil in, a little bit of olive oil to run as a dip as opposed to drinking liquids. And so that would be kind of where the vessel breaks and is used similar. Something that would be absolutely different, I'm not sure, it's not popping up into my head what would be an example for that, but some sort of example. I'm not sure if, for instance, if even, let's say, using it to cover something like spit on the floor. So I'm not sure if that would be considered something that's still 100% different. And it's because you would maybe even put a cup on top of spit, or something else. But if there's an example, then there would be a question if you're allowed to use it or not. Some say you can, some say you cannot. Okay. Footnote number 6 we're talking about here is about also bones that were stripped today of their meat and are fit for dogs. So he says in footnote number 6, or any animal in the vicinity, obviously. He says in the vicinity, meaning what he's at, and again, the footnotes are not the original text, it's from the original text. But he quotes from the Shulchan Aruch 308-29. I'm assuming what he's saying, meaning to say is, let's say animals that you're allowed to feed on Shabbos, but not your animals. We discussed about which animals, like for instance, our dogs, halachically brought down that you could feed stray dogs on Shabbos, or any other animals that you're allowed to feed on Shabbos. So if they have use for this bone, you could use it. You could throw it to them on Shabbos. So he says all these things that we mentioned in law number 1 may be handled on Shabbos. You could touch them. But on Yom Tif, laws of Muksa are more stringent. On Yom Tif, Mishnah Brura 495, Shulchan Aruch Harav. The Alter Rebbe, and we're going to learn when we get to the laws of holiday. There's a whole tractate of Beitza. The holiday is in certain ways in the laws of Muksa more strict than Shabbos because of the leniencies of cooking. The rabbis were more strict. Means there's a lot of handling that you do on Yom Tif that you don't do on Shabbos, just because the cooking, for instance, when the question of an egg that's born on Shabbos, right? And Shabbos, you can't. I mean, most people don't eat raw eggs. On Yom Tif, the question is, can you cook the egg or use it in baking, what have you? Because you're allowed to cook and bake on Shabbos on Yom Tif. So the laws of handling muktzah on Yom Tif in certain ways, the Mishnah Brura and the Shulchan Aruch Harav say that you can't learn what we're learning now to apply it necessarily to the laws of holiday, because then you have to check the laws of holiday, because they're more stringent when it comes to the laws of muktzah, of things that you can handle. Although obviously other things that holidays are much more lenient than Shabbos, you're allowed to cook on Yom Tif, but because you're allowed to cook on Yom Tif, therefore there's more concern that you may touch things that you're not allowed to touch on Yom Tif. You would use them in ways that you shouldn't on Yom Tif. Okay. Why are raisins and dates more extreme? So he says like this: drying dates and raisins are absolutely set aside, not to be used until ready. Additionally, during the one stage in the process, they are repulsive and unfit for eating. These two factors render them muktzah. Means the Shulchan Aruch says, why are raisins and dates, while they're being dried, muktzah more than cookies or things that you thought you wouldn't use, or like foods that could only be eaten in extreme circumstances. He says because they have two things. One thing is that people do not touch them while they're being dried, and number two, there is a stage where they're mamish repulsive, meaning to say that you couldn't even eat them in an extreme circumstance. Because of those two reasons together, if you set raisins and dates up on your roof or outside, my grandmother used to do it all the time in LA. She would put grapes out to turn, at home to turn them into raisins. Once you put them out, you're not allowed to touch them on Shabbos. Additionally, since at twilight of Friday they are unfit to eat, they remain muksa throughout Shabbos. So this is the Chayadam, Shulchan Aruch Rav Si also Masechtas Shabbos 45:8. Again, so that there's also the question is when we're going to learn the laws of cooking of when it goes into Shabbos, where was it holding as far as its readiness for cooking? And going into Shabbos, it was not ready to be eaten. So therefore, there was no scenario for you that you thought about touching it. And that's considered an example of something that's been muksa, totally set aside with no intention of touching it. And do not touch your raisins or your dates that are drying on the Shabbos. Okay, let's do one more law and then open for questions. What about foods that are not considered edible in even extreme circumstances? For instance, the only way to eat them is if you would cook them. Even though that this is your food that you want to eat for yourself, even though in theory you could give it to your animals couldn't eat it, can't eat it raw. Here there's the difference. For instance, if you have a steak in your freezer, you can't eat it raw, right? In your fridge, you can't eat it raw. But in theory, you could throw it to your dog, but you're not throwing a steak to your dog. You're throwing a bone to your dog, not your steak. So since it's 100% set aside for human consumption, you can't just pick it up now because in theory, if you would choose to, you could give it to your animal, but you didn't buy it for that reason. You didn't go to the store and pay $40 for the steak to feed your animal a steak, unless that was the scenario. Since they were set aside for human consumption, not now on Shabbos because they're not cooked, but Saturday night you could make the steak. And they're not, therefore you didn't buy them and they're not made for animals, therefore they're muksa. There are certain things that they have absolutely no practical use on Shabbos. Wood, or feathers of a bird, or skins, hides of animals, semer or pishtan, wool or flocks. These are things that are just materials. You have absolutely no use for them on Shabbos. And now we learn the laws. Animals, even domestic animals at home, are considered muksa. Again, we discussed 2 weeks ago, about certain home pets that are very attached to people if you're allowed to hug them on Shabbos, and there's leniencies about that, but we're talking about in general animals at home. Or, this is the complicated, klipe goizim, klipe beitzim, peels of nuts and eggs, batzamis kashis, very hard bones that have no use, shein ruin lafil klavim, even dogs won't eat them. Udlasis v'chalanis abayis, your door, let's say you have a movable door, you're not allowed to pick up your door on Shabbos, it's muksa. You're allowed to open and close your door, but you can't, let's say you have a window that goes in and out. If that the laws of Shabbos are very strict about what you're allowed to touch on Shabbos. So just windows and doors, planks of wood, you're not allowed to touch on Shabbos. Also, the place of Shabbos, you're not allowed, in a scenario where you're not allowed to hang them up on Shabbos, like we learned the laws of what kind of doors and windows could be closed on Shabbos. But if it doesn't meet the conditions that you could use them on Shabbos, therefore they're muksa. Or if something breaks and they have absolutely no use, if you have a vessel that breaks that has no longer any use at all, anything like this, asur matilta, this is what's considered muksa. What about if there's a danger? A pitcher shatters, has no use. But if you leave it on the floor, obviously it's going to cause harm to children or animals. And that happens all the time. Obviously, on Shabbos, you're handling a lot of dishes with guests. Dishes break all the time. So do not leave it on the floor. You're allowed to pick up the broken pieces of glasses because it will cause injury. All right. Footnote number 9. What are we talking about? Since it is meant to be eaten by people afterwards, okay, we're talking about food that's for humans, and therefore muksa. So the Mishnah Berurah says it's muksa. because you're not going to, it's not, you didn't buy the steak for the animals. So any kind of, if you have raw fish, whatever it is, doesn't make a difference. It's food that is not, that can only be edible if after Shabbos. There's no way that you could eat this food today. It's muksa, end of story. And that's a big problem. For instance, you have to know, if you have a fridge on Shabbos, right, and your fridge is full of foods, that not all the foods you have in your fridge are meant to be eaten on Shabbos. It's very possible you have raw chicken, raw fish. If it's in a scenario, I mean, we're not about people that eat raw salmon that you could throw into salad. I'm talking about foods that will not be eaten because of its situation now, right? A person will not eat a raw rib steak. I mean, most people, 99% of people will not eat that. It's dangerous. Raw livers, other foods, right? And you have it in your fridge on Shabbos. Are you allowed to pick it up and move it on Shabbos? We're going to learn the laws of things that are muksa and they take space. Are you allowed to move things that are muksa but they take space? You need their space. You want to put the soup back in the fridge and your steak is sitting there. You don't plan on you can't eat it till Saturday night or Sunday, but you need the space. We'll learn all those laws of how about moving things, but in theory, just picking up the steak in the fridge, you're not allowed to on Shabbos. Footnote number 10. Oh, well, long one. Okay. What are we talking about over here? So all this that we discussed and similar things are forbidden to be handled on Shabbos. They are muktzah because they are useless and are not considered a kli, a vessel. They may not even be handled when needed for some use or for the use of the space they occupy. Okay, so here he's saying that if it's even, we're talking about that they're taking up space. So here he says, if they occupy space, you're not allowed to touch them. You may not even move them to avoid monetary loss. Let's say for whatever reason, Shabbos came in and you left your steak outside the fridge. And if you were to leave it outside the fridge for the next 26 hours, it's going to get spoiled. You're not allowed to pick it up and put it into the fridge. Or damage or cause damage. So says the Mishnah Berurah 38146. Pet birds in their cages are not muksa according to Minchas Shabbos. Doesn't say why. The Machne Or Zerua 81 Shulchan Aruch Rav, however, prohibits pet birds. So the Alter Rebbe says that even pet birds are not allowed to be touched on Shabbos. However, the Rosh and the Morach, the Marach or Zerua prohibit handling any living creature. This ruling has been accepted. See Chassam Sofer about handling animals on Shabbos. So the question is birds. We've talked last week about today. There's some leniencies about hugging dogs if they're your comfort animal. But we're talking about just handling animals, pets on Shabbos, even birds in cages. The Alter Rebbe says one should not. Glass that's broken, whether pottery may be removed to avoid injury is disputed. Glass is obviously cause more damage than broken china. The Mishnah Berurah based on Magen Avraham prohibits it. Pri Megadim based on the Rabba permits it. So there's a disagreement when it comes to earthenware that could cause damage, obviously not in the way of glass. So there's some people that dispute and says that you have to leave it on the floor. Okay, then we're going to stop here unless there's any questions. All right, I'm glad everything's understood. Okay, Laila Tov, everyone. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Welcome.